Morning, everybody. If we could make a start. What I'd like to do first, as usual, is just to do some introductions because certainly in terms of members who are here today, it's very nice to see members who are not members of this committee. So welcome. We have a lot of officers and we have representatives from EAS and one of our head teachers who is going to be working for us on additional needs. So I think it's nice if, for our watching audience of millions, if we introduce ourselves. So my name is Martin Grokert. I chair this committee.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny.
Richard Williams, Democratic Services.
Richard John, Cabinet Member for Children and Young People.
Alison Waters, Head Teacher, Durand Primary School and currently seconded as Inclusion Implementation Officer.
Will McLean, Chief Officer, Children and Young People.
Sharon Randall-Smith, Head of Service for Standards and CYP.
Helen Power, Principal Challenge Advisor for Monmouthshire from the EAS.
Richard Austin, Principal Officer Inclusion, Monmouthshire CYP.
Keith Plough, Vice Chair, Monmouthshire Association of School Governors.
Mike Fowler, Parent Governor Representative.
Councillor Maureen Powell, Member of the Committee and Member for Castlewood and Abergavenny.
Joanne Watkins, Councillor for Caldecott Castle and Member of this Committee.
Sheila Woodhouse. Oh, sorry, I missed.
Apologies, I didn't think I'd have to introduce myself. Jim Higginson, Member for 7 Ward Caldecott. I'm here in observation capacity only today.
Councillor Roger Harris, Cresson Ward, Abergavenny, ex-member of the committee and here in the same capacity as Councillor Higginson.
Reverend Malcolm Lane, Councillor for the Mardy.
Sheila Woodhouse, Grofield Ward, Abergavenny, Member of the Committee.
Councillor Val Smith, Llanbaddock Ward, observing.
Nikki Wellington, Finance Manager, CYP.
Dave Barnes, Data and Information Systems Officer.
A very warm welcome to everybody, and perhaps an especially warm welcome to Keith Plough, who has been on this committee a lot longer than I have, but hasn't been able to get to the last couple of meetings following an operation. So welcome back, Keith. It's good to have you back on board. Do we have any apologies for absence?
Yes, Chair. Apologies from Councillors Brown, Jones, Thomas, and also from Dr. Daly.
Okay. Does anybody need to make a declaration of interest at this point? Okay, moving on then. I see no members of the public who wish to make a presentation. So if we could have a look at the minutes of the meeting of the 14th of September. And what I'd like to do is, rather than go through these twice, I'd like to go through them for accuracy and matters arising page by page as we go through. So in your agenda bundles then, we start at, he said, scrolling through. We start at page 1 in the bundle, page 2, page 3, page 4, I just have a question. We had the presentation from about the future delivery, and our cabinet member was going to respond on behalf of the county. Do we know if that actually went through?
Chair, I'll have to check and come back to you.
Okay, thanks. Page 5. Page 6. Page 7. Page 8. Page 9. Page 10. Page 11. Page 12. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. On page 12, on the summary of the performance of schools at Key Stage 4 in the last academic year, so the summer outcomes 2017, we've just seemed to have inverted the two schools in the penultimate and the anti-penultimate bullet points. It was actually Chepstow Comprehensive School that advanced to 68%, and it was King Henry VIII and Caldecott schools who performances had dropped back slightly. So if that could be corrected, that would be really good. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Page 13. Page 14. I just have a query here that on page 14, under member scrutiny, the first bullet point, the Welsh stream in King Henry VIII had been tried in the past. I'm not aware that there has ever been a Welsh stream at King Henry VIII. So I think we just need to delete that sentence. Page 15. Page 16. Okay. Are you happy that I sign them then as with that slight amendment that I sign them? Proposed by Councillor Powell and seconded by Councillor Watkins. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, really quite an important agenda item then. This is on page 17 now of the packs, the school performance reporting. You should have had an additional report here, the additional report to complete the pack, which was about the comparison by gender and free school meals and the rest of the cohort. So over to our officers for a lead on where we are following the publication of last summer's results.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everybody. We're pleased to present the outcomes for our children at the end of the three key stages around the foundation phase, which is up to year 2 for pupils, then Key Stage 2, which takes children up to year 6, the end of primary school, and Key Stage 3, which is the end of year 9. These are teacher assessments that we are reporting on to you today. The first thing I just wanted to offer a comment on to you as a committee was in terms of the numbers of papers that you've received today. When we met last time, there was a comment from a member of the committee about the amount of, or the ability to interrogate the outcomes when we were discussing at a very high level Key Stage 4. I'm also conscious this is the first time that that this committee, in its current constitution, will have discussed an end of phase set of results. So what we have done in the presentation of the papers today is to provide probably more information than we would normally. But it really serves to hopefully illustrate to you the way that we can analyse and manipulate that data for your benefit. I'm grateful to colleagues, to Sharon, to Helen and her colleagues at the EAS, and to David, who sat at the back, who've done much of the work around looking at how our children have performed. So there is an awful lot of data here. I recognise that entirely, and I recognise that sometimes it's not the easiest to access. I hope the way that it's structured will have done that. And perhaps if I just talk through the structure of the papers that you have in your packs today, that will allow us to kind of go through this in a way which is helpful. There has been circulated a covering report, which is in the format which you'd expect to see a scrutiny report at Monmouthshire County Council, and that's in that fixed kind of format. The first paper then, which is included, is a report that's been produced by the EAS, and that's at a high level and looks at the outcomes right across the county. And that looks at variances at a county level and on a trend basis, so year-on-year comparators. It also looks at expected level +1, the difference of performance between boys and girls, and the difference in performance of those eligible for free school meals and those not eligible for free school meals. I think what the remainders of the papers do is really hopefully to provide you with greater insight into the range of outcomes that we have actually in Monmouthshire. So papers 1A, 1B and 1C pick up each of those key phases. So 1A would be around, 1B would be around the foundation phase, and you can see in there that at the bottom of that first page of that report, the important part there is in terms of, and this is for illustrative purposes only at this point, we'll come to talk to the data in a second, that you can see there the gap closing in terms of the range of variance that exists within our schools. So that's the purpose of those papers, 1B, 1C and 1D. 5D takes us on to the performance of children who are eligible for free school meals, and that paper is structured that it looks at the core indicators, so the foundation phase indicator, the core subject indicator at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, but looks at the indicator and all of the component parts on the variance between achievement of those eligible for free school meals and those not eligible for free school meals. 5D2 then does exactly the same, but that looks at the difference between the attainment of boys and girls. So that's how we've set out those reports. So they kind of work in a hierarchy. So as you go down through the reports, you can access more information about how our children have performed this year. If members are content, I will offer some high-level observations in terms of the county-wide position, and then I'm glad to say that I'm ably here today with colleagues who will have far more detail in terms of the outcomes at various schools that you might wish to ask questions about, or about some of the specific outcomes and some of the actions that we're taking to improve outcomes in the future years. So if we go back to the paper which was produced by the EAS, which is paper 1A, according to my electronic agenda, if I just talk you through that, hopefully that will provide you with that high-level oversight that we can then look into more detail with members' questions. The first thing to note is that it sets out very clearly for you when we're talking around expected levels. Expected levels is the level of attainment that we expect our children to get to at the end of their key stages. So at the foundation phase, we expect our children to achieve outcome 5. If they are more able, then they will achieve the expected level +1, which would be outcome 6. At Key Stage 2, the expected level is level 4. The expected level +1 is level 5. We then move to a slightly strange situation at Key Stage 3, whereby we have an expected level of level 5, and then we're able to differentiate at 2 successive levels, expected level +1 and expected level +2. In this report today, we've only concentrated on the expected level +1. If it was something that people were interested in, we can have some analysis from the All Wales Core data set about the percentage of our children who are achieving the expected level +2. So for our more able and our gifted children, that's an area of increasing interest. And when we come to look at the number of children who are achieving the expected level, i.e. level 5, so they're achieving that level at the end of year 6, we would expect to see progress at 2 levels potentially for some of those children by the end of year 9. So there's a rich context to the data that we'll talk about this morning. In terms of foundation phase, the report is very helpful in the way that it presents this information. The first graph, and it repeats the information in the same way, so there's a consistency for members. You'll see that on the first graph on page 3 of the individual report, I'm not sure what it is in the pack, you will see all of the authorities in Wales from left to right. On the left-hand side is the lowest entitlement to free school meals. On the right-hand side is the highest. So you can see Monmouthshire on the extreme left and Blaenau Gwent on the extreme right. So it helps you just kind of visually contextualise what potentially our expectations should be of our performance. You can see there that last year, in terms of the foundation phase indicator, we achieved 93.8%. That was an increase of 2.1% on the previous year, and that ranked us as the top performing authority in Wales. So a really strong performance in terms of the foundation phase indicator. You can see there in the graph beneath that matches our trend over the past period, where we have always been consistently performing at the maximal level in terms of the foundation phase indicator. Just to talk you through the graph, which is at the top of page 4, because again, this is a style of graph which you will see repeated throughout the report. The yellow element of the bar represents those children who are achieving the expected level +1. The blue part of the bar represents the kind of the topping up of the children who are achieving the expected level. The red dot represents the Wales performance, and the black tab, if you can see that on your screens, represents the target that we set for ourselves. So you'll see that pattern of graph repeat itself again. And you can see there that we have consistently outperformed Welsh performance across all of those areas in the year 2017, and that we have been very close to or have achieved our target in each of those years as well. Not only is it really pleasing to see our improved performance in terms of the foundation phase indicator, but you can see that we've achieved our performance in all of the constituent parts of the indicator as well. So we've improved in learning and communication in both English and Welsh, in mathematical development and personal social development, in which you can see there, all of those figures, being above 94% really is testament to the work that our primary sector is doing at the foundation phase. The table just below that picks up the number of pupils who are achieving at the expected level +1. Again, really pleasing to see the percentages of our children who are achieving and accessing those higher levels. We've seen improvements at English and Welsh. We have fallen back, well, the report shows that we've fallen back. I think that's a rounding and a kind of a software-generated downward arrow. There must be a percentage point somewhere there. I think standstill would be a fairer way of reflecting that. You can see our personal social development again increasing. I think this is all about setting for you really the context about the very strong performance we have at the foundation phase. One thing just to note, and an early marker from me really in terms of potential scrutiny in the future, the way in which outcome 6 will be assessed in the future will be different. And I think we can expect to see a fallback in the number of children who are accessing the higher levels at foundation phase from this summer on. So 2018, it's a different means of assessment. I've written to schools, I've also written to all parents actually, just to outline that change in assessment. But more recently, we've also had correspondence from Welsh Government about that as well. So that's just one thing just to note there. You'll see then that we pick up the gender differentials. Again, really positive this year. You can see that the gender gap, if I just focus on the core indicator, has fallen from 8.6% last year, just down to 2.6%. So we were underperforming the Welsh comparative position last year. We are now considerably closer in terms of that attainment, which I think is really positive. And I think that reflects the interventions that we've been advocating in schools about how boys can better perform in terms of the foundation phase indicator. In terms of the outcomes at outcome 6, we've seen some differentials there. We're still outside the Welsh performance in terms of English. So our boys aren't doing as well as we would have hoped compared to the national perspective. But again, that's one of those things which we do tend to see a bigger gender gap at foundation phase, and we do tend to see that close at Key Stage 2 outcomes. The final piece is just around the Wales rankings. Really pleased to say that you can see there in 2017 that we were the top performing authority across all indicators. Contextualise that against our status as the authority with the lowest level of free school meals, and there would be a degree of expectation, but that's not to underestimate the work that's gone into that, and how pleased we should be with that performance. So a very positive set of outcomes in terms of the foundation phase. If members are content, I'll carry on in that style for Key Stage 2 and 3, if that's okay? Yeah. Excellent. Okay, for Key Stage 2, so this is the end of primary school, you can see that there has been a very slight decline in our performance from 2016. 93.2% of pupils achieved the core subject indicator, which is a combination of English or Welsh, maths and science. And it was 0.9%, so a relatively small percentage point fall below the 94.1% we achieved in 2016. That moved us to the second highest performing authority in Wales, slightly outside where we are in terms of our eligibility for free school meals, but nevertheless, it's a very, very small reduction on an already very high performing indicator. So again, just to go through those graphs, you can see there as we work them through that, you know, again, you can see our trend has been very close to being at maximal performance across the last period of time. And, you know, and again, that's evidenced at the top of page 7 of my report, where you can see there how well we're achieving, again, meeting targets and exceeding the Welsh performance as well, that Welsh dot. You can see how we've fallen in terms of the CSI, in terms of level 4. At the middle of page 7, you can see there have been very slight fallbacks, and they are really slight, and I think that's really important for us to just keep that in mind. In terms of English, a fallback from 95.9% to 95.3%. In terms of Welsh language, a bigger fallback, and we'll talk a little bit potentially about the performance of our Welsh first language at Key Stage 2 at the end of this discussion, falling back from 95.1 to 86.8. Maths, very slight fallback, 95.2 to 94.5, and science, 97.2 down to 95.3. And the combination and the read across of the children achieving those subjects is what's led to that slight fallback in terms of the core subject indicator. I think it would be fair to say, and one of the things which I've said to head teachers throughout my tenure so far, is that there will be volatility at the expected level. There will be volatility due to change of cohort, individual classes, recognising that in some classes we will have children who have additional learning needs or might have experienced trauma during a year, which actually might have impeded them achieving the level they might otherwise have achieved. So we can expect a degree of volatility and kind of some movements in terms of the outcomes in terms of the expected level. However, what I'm really pleased to see, and this was my challenge very much to the head teachers, was that we continue to push very hard to make sure that we're the percentage of pupils achieving the expected level +1 is where our focus is. We know that with our levels of free school meal entitlement and the nature of the county, that's the area that we need to focus. So you can see in the table beneath the expected level table, you can see that we have made progress across all of the core subjects in terms of English, in terms of Welsh, in terms of maths and science, in terms of our achievements at the expected level +1. I'm really pleased about that. That was an area that we indicated as being an area for challenge. It was indicated specifically in the EAS's business plan, in the Monmouthshire appendix. So you can see that that kind of identification, planning for interventions, and now the outcomes coming through to that. So again, that's a positive thing for us to see. In terms of our performance with regards to the boys and girls, you can see that that's set out at the top of page 8. Broadly, we're very close to having parity between boys and girls in terms of the CSI, which I think is really positive, and that reflects that closing of the gap that I described as we see from foundation phase into level 4. And again, the final part there is around the All Wales rankings. You can see there have been some downward movements in terms of the CSI. We're down from first place to second place. In Welsh, first language, so that's in our two schools, Ysgol Fyn and Ysgol Fenni. You can see that there has been volatility there, but you can see that over the past 3 years, you know, there's been a movement from 20th to 6th to 21st, and that's very much around the nature of only having 2 classes. We did have a very small cohort in one of the classes that was assessed last year, and that does lead to that kind of level of variability. Maths, again, we've moved from first to second, but science we've held at first as well. So the overall position, I think, is really pleasing there. You know, for 4 out of the 5 indicators at the end of primary school, we're in the top 1 or 2 positions in Wales. And again, that's a position of strength as our children transition then into secondary school. Key Stage 3 is the final part of the report that we're talking about today. And again, we're seeing continued improvement at the end of Key Stage 3. 92.7% achieving the core subject indicator. So that's nearly an increase of a whole percentage point, 0.8 percentage points from our performance in 2016. And we're ranked second in Wales for that indicator. I think if you look at the graph actually on the bottom of page 9 there, I think you'll see that Key Stage 3 has been an area that we haven't always had such high levels of success in. And I think I'm really pleased to see the work that our secondary schools have done in closing that gap compared to what our expectations are. And our expectations will always be very high. And I think that's really important that we hold that. And you can see that over that period of 2009 to 2015, we really did move away from those very kind of highest levels of performance. But over the past 2 years, we've really seen that gap close right back down. And that's really pleasing to see. Again, if we just kind of turn the page onto page 10 of my report, we can go through and you can see here the additional levels identified that I did talk about at the outset. So you can see there the percentage of pupils achieving level 6, which is expected level +1, and level 7, expected level +2. As with all of these, what these should be doing is providing us with some expectation and clarity about what our expectations should potentially be when these pupils come to sit their external examinations at the end of Key Stage 4. So this is all building a much richer picture around how we set our targets and about how we manage our expectations for our children in the future. If we go to the expected level, which is level 5, and again, just that reminder that this is the one, the expected level +1 that we talked about at the end of year 6, you can see there that we've seen improved performance at the core subject indicator in English, maths and science. The Welsh one, although it's included here, we don't have any Welsh secondary provision at the moment, so that's why there's no numbers reported there. You can see at the expected level +1, we've had a slight decline in terms of our English performance from 72.7 down to 71.4%, but maths and science have both increased their performance at the expected level +1. And then when we move on to the expected level +2, so these are the very, very highest levels of outcome, you can see that we've performed at the highest level we've ever achieved at English, maths and science. Expected level +2, being level 7 at the end of Key Stage 3, Year 9, should give us a very, very high level of confidence in terms of those children translating those into the very best outcomes at the end of GCSE. The EAS have done a piece of work, which it might be interesting to bring back to this committee at some stage in the future, where they look to a piece of regression analysis, looking at the best outcomes at the end of GCSE and tracking those back through to see how the percentages work through. So, you know, if you're converting, so we know this summer that across our 4 secondaries, I think 27% of our children achieved 5 A stars. You know, what levels should our expectation be, given that we know what number of children are achieving level 7 at the end of Key Stage 3? So there's some interesting read-through which helps us kind of really challenge our schools and hold them to account for what they're doing. So I hope that that's interesting and just gives the committee something to think about in the future in terms of how we challenge our more able students. We then pick up the piece around gender differentials. You can see there that we've closed the gender differential at the expected level from 4.3% to 3.4%. Both last year and this year are better than the Welsh position in terms of boys versus girls performance. And again, you can see at the expected level +1, we've closed that gap again, although it has widened at the expected level +2. And they are wider than the Wales's average gender at that point. So that's a challenge for us about how we think about making sure that our boys are achieving as well as they can at the end of Key Stage 3. Again, in terms of the position, you can see there, in terms of our Welsh position, that we were second in CSI, English and Maths, and the highest performing authority in science. So again, really positive to note, I think, that we are achieving at the top 1 or 2 positions across all of those indicators in Wales, and should give us really high level of confidence as we go into the next steps. The final part of the paper is around the national tests and how we've done on those. National tests are undertaken by students from year 2 to year 9. And they're assessed in a standardised method. And at this point, I will definitely be looking to my left for more expert input than I will be able to offer. They are a hugely helpful piece of information for us because they correlate and they give us a testing point between what our children are achieving on an external test, which is marked externally as well, compared to our teacher assessment. And it provides us, they're not assessing the same thing, and I think that's very clear and important to say, but it does allow us to have some kind of test against it. So we'd expect to see, you know, if a school is reporting very high percentages of children achieving at the highest levels in their teacher assessment, we would expect to see, you know, a correlation of either being in the same quartile or maybe the quartile down. You know, as I said, it's not assessing exactly the same thing, but a correlation in terms of where they are in terms of their national tests and in terms of their teacher assessment. So they're very useful in terms of that. You can see at the end of page 13 there, in terms of our national performance, that we're at second place in terms of our reading English, reading Welsh, in terms second place in terms of our procedural numeracy assessment, but we dropped down to 4th in terms of our numeracy reasoning. Having had one of my children take that numeracy reading last year, numeracy reasoning, you know, he came back and didn't like that, and I think that was an experience that was echoed across the county. I suspect that's probably too anecdotal to draw upon as real evidence, but you know, I think, you know, there were some kind of concerns around that, and I think that's an area of continued focus on behalf of Sharon's work and the EAS. The final page of that report does contain some provisional information about Key Stage 4. I'd ask that you disregard that at the moment. That was calculated on the day. We will bring back to you in December a full report on the outcomes of Key Stage 4. And that will be kind of contextualised as in the whole Welsh position and how our vulnerable groups, our FSM learners and so on, have performed. I'll pause there. Obviously, all of the data that is being provided in the supporting papers does identify the ranges of performance that exist within our schools and so on, and more detail around groups such as the free school meal groups. So, colleagues, I know will be happy to take questions, as will I. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLean. And could I thank you for the clarity with which you presented that for non-expert audience here. So thank you very much indeed. Any questions for the Director? Mr. Fowler.
Hi. So looking at the bottom of your page 7, of which it abruptly quits your page 7, but there we go. I'm looking at the end of Key Stage 2. It's very pleasing to see that we're doing terribly well at the +1s, and I know that has been a drive from both the EAS and locally. But to see a decline then at the expected level in all those indicators, I'm just worried that we're aiming at the top and not bringing up from the bottom as well.
Thank you for your question. Certainly, we know at Key Stage 2 this year, there were a number of pupils that we had identified within schools on the code of practice, and therefore, whilst those pupils did achieve the potential, and in some cases achieved greater than their targets, that reflected in overall results for some of our schools. For example, and in some of our schools, one pupil makes a very big difference because the cohort numbers are quite small. And therefore, our ranking has moved down by, I think there's 0.4 percentage points difference between us and the authority that's ranked above us. So whilst it does look like a slight decline, of course, that's the case. However, there are good reasons for it, and it doesn't mean that there isn't a focus on the expected level. It doesn't mean that our schools aren't meeting the individual needs of all of the pupils.
Just to add to that, in terms of challenge advisors going into the schools, that would be something that they would be discussing with the head teachers as well, so that they would be saying, you've identified these children with additional learning needs. Can you explain what sort of support you're giving to them so that we know they're being pushed as much as they possibly can and being given the right support?
If I could just add one other part to those answers. I think the other thing that we do at this time of year, interestingly, is we look at the targets that our schools are setting, and we go through a very rigorous process, first of all with the AS and then with the local authority, having those discussions with the school about where we see that they might have projected targets for performance beneath the median or the fourth quartile potentially, which we've had some instances of in the last couple of years. And really, I think for the first time, asking those schools to come in and having a very real expectation that they're giving full account in terms of what their targets are. And actually, there was no quarter given in terms of people kind of targeting less than our very highest expectations. So it's certainly our expectation to teach for all of our students to achieve their very best. It's just exactly as Sharon identified, we can have instances in classes whereby, one or two children with additional learning needs can have a real impact in terms of the outcomes for that cohort. But we do really test that through the target setting process as well.
Any other questions from members of the committee? I'd like to ask about Key Stage 3 outcomes. English doesn't seem to be at the same level as maths and science. Could I ask what we're doing to try to bring about a greater equality with English outcomes?
Again, that would be some of the work from the challenge advisors going into the schools. There's a very strong team in the EAS of literacy support, so where the challenge advisor thinks they may need some additional strategies to improve levels of teaching and to raise those standards, that would be a bespoke package from the EAS to support with that.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments from officers about that before we move on? In that case, Mr. McLean, are you going to talk to us about the analysis of gender and free school meals, or have you said all you need to say already on that? Do you want to, that supplementary report that was sent out to us, have you covered that?
I think, Chair, I've probably said at the highest level all I probably really need to. I think there is, as I mentioned at the outset, there's a lot of information and data there.
I just wanted to make sure I wasn't going to cut you off in your prime.
No, feel free.
In that case, let's move on to item 6, which is along similar lines, really, but this is our small cohort of looked after children. I know Councillor Powell often makes the point, and it's a point well worth making, that when we're looking at percentages and you're talking about a very, very small number of children, then one child makes a huge difference. Having said that, these are potentially among our most vulnerable young people, and we really do need to guarantee that we, as collective parents, as councillors, that we really are doing all we can in our power to ensure that these young people are getting the very best deal. So, Mr. Austin.
Thanks, Chair. What I will say before I start the report is that Monmouthshire has taken the lead with the Welsh Government this year in how we actually report on looked after children outcomes. Previously, we reported on all looked after children in one sort of document, regardless of what educational setting that they were educated in. We have looked after children who are educated in mainstream. We have looked after children who are educated in special needs educational establishments, which may be in county or maybe out of county. There are looked after children who are unaccompanied asylum seekers, and there are looked after children who are educated in pupil referral units and EOTAS type provision. Hence, when we were reporting at a local level, regional level and a national level in previous years, we were just reporting on the totality of looked after children and their outcomes. I've sort of given a presentation to Welsh Government, and we are now far more analytical about the way in which we report on looked after children. And I think when you look at the content of the report and the way that that's presented, hopefully that will come across for members. The other point to note is that the way in which funding is distributed to support looked after children has changed. Previously, that used to come to the local authority, and we could use to target individual looked after children. That is now being distributed on a regional grant by the EAS, and that's distributed to clusters. Our clusters put in bids and submissions as to how they're going to spend the money to support their looked after children in their clusters. This can range from a variety of interventions, such as Thrive approaches in the Monmouth cluster, to mentors in the Abergavenny cluster, transitional programmes in the Chepstow cluster, and then additionally Thrive and mentors in the Caldecott cluster. So all that funding is now spent by schools to target the outcomes of looked after pupils, and that's not just Monmouthshire looked after pupils, it's any Welsh LAC child within the school. So just to put that in a context, okay? When looking at the report, you will see that foundation phase, it appears that we didn't report or we didn't track previously up until 2016-17. There wasn't a requirement on us to report under Welsh Government indicators on looked after children at foundation phase before that. We are now reporting on each key phase. So the first part of the report looks at looked after children in a mainstream school context. As we can see, that the Chief Officer mentioned that foundation phase pupils are doing well in his report. This is mirrored and echoed by our looked after children. So these are Monmouthshire looked after children, where 100% of them, 5 out of 5, have achieved the foundation phase indicator. You will note as well that as well as the percentages, because the numbers are small, Chair, that the raw data is there for sort of it enables members to have an idea of the small size of the cohort. Moving to Key Stage 2, you will note that in 16-17, 6 out of 7 looked after children were in mainstream provision. They achieved, 7 children were in mainstream provision, and 6 out of 7 achieved the Key Stage 2 indicator. The one child that didn't had additional needs, had a statement for that, but was working at the expected level. So that's how closely we track. We track at an individual pupil level, and you know, because the numbers are small, we then undertake sort of 3-year rolling averages, so we can see that the trend over the last 3 years is increasing for our primary looked after children outcomes at Key Stage 2. This is at this point, when we come on to Key Stage 3, I need to make a point. It would be reasonable to assume that we got youngsters in foundation phase, then Key Stage 2, that these youngsters may transfer to Key Stage 3. That's what a Welsh local government officer thought. However, LAC children population is variable. Some of these looked after children could return home to be living with parents and then not be LAC. They could be adopted, they could go to special guardianship, or could go to kinship care. And then in Key Stage 3, we can get different pupils come into the system for different care reasons. So we're not comparing like with like, so it's really difficult to look at trends. We're looking at totally different cohorts, okay? Within Key Stage 3 last year, of the pupils that were lack for the requisite time, 50% achieved the CSI, obviously 3 out of 6. Of the 3 that didn't, 1 was a statemented pupil, diagnosed with additional needs, and 2 others missed it just on the numeracy element alone. So the challenge that we put forward to our colleagues in schools is how can we close that gap in numeracy for these individual pupils. When we look at Key Stage 4, this is where the disaggregation, I think, is quite stark. And when we look at where youngsters are educated. The first table talks about our cohort of 3 pupils in a mainstream provision last year. Of those 3 pupils, 2 achieved the level 2 inclusive, which we're really, really pleased with. 1 achieved level 1. So they all achieved at their expected levels, so we were pleased with that. Then, when we look at pupils that were educated in specialist provision, there was 1 child last year that we were educating in a 52-week placement who had a high degree of additionality of needs, hence the 52 weeks. Unfortunately, that child's needs was such that they didn't achieve a qualification. Then the next table talks about looked after children who were educated in PRU and IOTAS provision. We had 2 such young people. The one I think the local authority did really well with, because this was a child who was statemented. He was in specialist provision, but that specialist provision said that they could no longer meet need. Numerous care placements. We had a decision to make as officers then whether we would wait for another authority, because this person was educated out of authority, whether we wait for that authority to put provision in, or whether as the corporate parent we did what we felt was best, ensure that we commissioned tuition, even though that child wasn't living in Monmouthshire, put him on the role of our provision PRU, so that he could sit the exams where he knew people, so we could maximise the opportunities of success. That child did achieve a qualification, and everybody involved felt that that was the right decision, because we ensured that that child did actually achieve something. The second child in that category didn't achieve any qualifications at all. I've got to be honest, as an officer, extremely disappointed about that, because that child was bright, capable of achieving L2+, but the social care circumstances were such that that child and the family totally disengaged from provision. We offered provision at college, we offered provision within one of our centres, we even offered provision at local library with our staff, we even offered provision at home, going with colleagues from social services. I think we exhausted all available options to try to engage that young person throughout the course of the year. I'm happy to take questions on that now.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. And again, thank you for putting that report in a way that was easily understandable to members of the committee. So thanks for that. Just for members' information, if you're not sure of all the acronyms, AOTAS means Education Other Than at School. And within the Monmouthshire context, I think I'm right in saying that's youngsters with medical needs that prevent them going to school. PRU is a pupil referral unit for those youngsters who can no longer sustain the normal curriculum at primary or secondary level, and is an alternative provision that is made to ensure that they receive education. Could I say that from the chair, that it is good to see that as officers you clearly understand these youngsters as people rather than just as statistics going through education, and that's really very reassuring. So are there any questions of the officer? Councillor Powell.
Not a question. I just want to thank Mr. Austin for such a good report, and as you say, so very clearly put and answered a lot of questions that I might have asked you. Thank you very much.
Councillor Watkins.
And likewise, thank you again. Obviously, we covered it in great deal of depth in corporate parenting, so it was great to have it brought to this committee as well, and I would like to reassure members that we went into it in great depth in corporate parenting as well, so thank you.
Thank you very much for that observation. Any other questions? Well, you've escaped quite lightly there, I think, Mr. Austin, but it's because you covered your ground so well. So thank you very much indeed. If we can move on then to agenda item 7, which is on page 59 in the bundle. Before we start this, I'm glad that we've got our cabinet member here today, because before we have a look at the actual ALN review, there is a related question from Councillor Watkins. So if you'd like to put that now, Councillor Watkins.
Thank you, Chair. We're about to be looking at the question of provision for additional learning needs within the county. And in the last couple of weeks, it has been brought to my attention that there will be a change, in fact, a reduction in the provision of additional learning needs in Caldecott Comprehensive for the academic year 2018. The Caldecott Comprehensive has a special needs referral unit and also, for the last number of years, has run what is called commonly the buffer class. The buffer class is a class of about 20 children who have an average range academically, but do have complex and comorbid conditions such as high-functioning autism, specific learning difficulties in dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, social, emotional, behavioural difficulties, attention deficit disorder, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. These children have been incredibly well catered for in this buffer class. It has been taught by a teacher and a very well-experienced teaching assistant. Parents, children and staff all believe this is the best way to educate these children. In particular, high-functioning autism children can experience high levels of anxiety. The class has been structured in a wonderful way so that these children can achieve their academic potential. I've spoken to parents who've said, "My son has now got qualifications I never believed he would get." I've spoken to a parent whose child has just gone into the buffer class this year in year 7, and she said he's already much happier than he was in primary school. And as a parent, she's getting better communication than she has ever known before. Speaking to the SENCO, Mr. Mock, who's also the Deputy Head of Caldecott Comprehensive, he has informed me that the reason they have been told they will not be running the buffer class for 2018 onwards is due to funding. They are having their funding cut. I would like to ask the Cabinet member, why are we reducing funding for our ALN children when, having sat through social justice conferences, we have talked about how we wish to improve the standards for our ALN children? Why are we cutting funding from this system that we know actually truly works? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. And if I can start by firstly thanking the chair for inviting me to the committee meeting. I'm one of the millions of viewers you referred to earlier on online, and it's a pleasure to actually come and attend in person. So thank you, and I'd be very happy to do so again in future if it's helpful to you. There have been some changes to the way that the ALN provision is provided for in Caldecott. Obviously, you will have seen the new ALN provision which you referred to, and I visited it myself, and it is fantastic, and I'd be happy to do so again. But you'll be aware that in the new builds in Caldecott and in Monmouth, we've provided additional ALN provision, which I suppose does include a reduction in Caldecott because we're providing additional support in Monmouth. Now, clearly there's, while there's been a reduction, there's been a change in the way that is therefore funded. And in those changes are being brought in gradually over 2 years, but there's a capacity of 55 in the new unit in Caldecott. I believe there's currently 42 students there. But the funding for students with perhaps more moderate needs is up to the school to decide how they allocate it. As I understand it, it's about 195,000 for moderate needs, and it's for the school to decide how they spend that in the most suitable way. But I'm very happy to meet with the member or visit the school again if there's something I can do to help with that. You mentioned the ALN review that was initiated by my predecessor, Liz Hackett-Payne, and I'm very pleased that that's progressing, and I'm grateful to Alison Waters for all the work that she's been doing on that. So I'd encourage members to engage with that. Obviously, we're nearing the end of that process. But we want to provide the very best facilities we can for every child in the county. And we have a number of challenges in how we do that, how we ensure that children have the ability to stay within Monmouthshire and access facilities that are best suited to their needs. So there are a number of challenges there, and this review is looking at how we address those for every child in our care. I don't know if officers have perhaps something to add to that, but as I say, very happy to visit the facility again or enter discussions with either yourself, Councillor Watkins, or with the school if that's helpful.
Just to clarify the position with the funding in Caldicot, the new school has an SNRB of 55 places. Currently, or last year, 75 places were identified within Caldicot. With the new build, we know that there seems to be a reduction actually in the Caldicot area. However, overall in Monmouthshire, we're increasing our numbers of SNRB places to 110. In the new Monmouthshire Comprehensive, there will be an SNRB of 55 places. So it's right and proper to think how that is managed. Nevertheless, I understand your concerns about those children who have been identified, and I'd like to reassure you that the unit funding for this particular year has been in just over £275,000 just for the unit itself, for the children that we know have the appropriate diagnosis and the appropriate statements to facilitate access to that provision. In addition to that, there's an additional amount of band funding, which will either be an extra 100% support for a teaching assistant or a 75% support for teaching assistant. This current year, that's just over 195,000. In-year adjustments have been made of around about 20,000. So that will give the school 215,000 to organise as it wishes. Now, it might be that the school wants to use that money to provide the buffer classes that it's been doing for many years. So the funding is actually there. In addition to that funding, there's another 48,000 that's allocated to the school, which is just their delegated lump sum, and that's based on number of pupils and deprivation. There's a formula that's used to calculate that across all of the schools in Monmouthshire. So that comes to around about 530,000. And all of our schools look at 5% of their budget, a percentage of their budget, to allocate towards meeting the needs of pupils who have additional learning needs. And for Caldicot, that's 179,000. So the school has access to a wide range of, a lot of funding in order to meet the needs of their pupils. It might be that they wish to organise and continue with their buffer classes, but they, just to reassure you, they have the funding to do that within their budget and additional funding from the local authority.
Okay, Councillor Watkins, do you want to come back on that?
Thank you, yes. Could I inquire, has this funding actually decreased, though? Is it, in comparison to last year, is there actually a reduction at all?
There has been a very small reduction in the amount of money for one of the buffer classes. Over the next 2 years, the funding will be reduced to reflect the reduction in the numbers from a 55-place SNRB to a 75 from 75 place to a 55, and that means that Caldicot will then be in line with the other three secondary schools in the local authority. So the funding stream that they will have will be absolutely the same as those other schools as it stands at the moment. Obviously, with the ALN review, one of the things we have to do is look at the funding going forward in order to take account of the new bill, the new provision that we require, and what we have within the county at that time.
Okay. Councillor Watkins, I'm sure you'll take that information and carry on digging, and if you feel you need to bring it back to this committee, then please feel free to do so. And can I thank our Cabinet member for his answer to the question as well. Right, we move on then to agenda item 7 on page 59 in the bundle.
I've got a presentation, Chair.
Sorry. Well, I've got that down as item 7. Maybe it's me. But in any case, whether it's me making the mistake or not, and it usually is me that makes the mistakes, I'd like to welcome Alison Waters, head of Durand School, to the committee today. I hope it's the first of several visits you'll be making to us. And members of this committee, you have been emailed the slides that Alison is going to use. If you're not a member of this committee, then hopefully you'll be able to see them on the screen. But thank you very much, and Alison, over to you.
Yeah, I'll kick off if that's okay, Chair.
Sorry, Mr. McLean, over to you.
It's a team effort this morning in terms of the ALN review. I'll offer just a couple of observations about our about the drivers behind the review. I'll then hand over to Sharon, who will take you through some of the detail part of it in terms of the needs assessment and understanding where we are currently. And then Alison is going to talk to you about the model that she's been involved in testing, designing, refining since she's been with us since the beginning of term. In terms of the need for a review, when I started acting up into the position last September, it was one of the areas that the Cabinet member at the time, as Councillor John rightfully identifies, was very keen to see progressed. When we had our Eston inspection in 2012, it was an area that was identified as being an area of challenge. Although it didn't make one of the 6 recommendations, it was one of our kind of and alsos, and it was an area clearly that we paid attention to through that process. There have been several reviews over the past period looking at what we need in Monmouthshire, but we felt at this time it was time to take a kind of decisive step and really kind of undertake this kind of fundamental review. The review has been root and branch. I'm extremely grateful to all of the head teachers and stakeholders who've been involved in the review with us. We had a steering group of about 20, I think, who were involved with us, between local authority officers, head teachers from primary and secondary, leads from all of our SNRB units were all involved in that, as were Snap Cymru, which is the parent advocacy group, and Children's Services from Monmouthshire as well. So a very broad group brought together to think about what we need in the future. The only other thing I'd just offer is that this was very much a review of inclusion services. So it wasn't simply for those children who have additional learning needs, it was for those children about how we keep all of our children in our schools, and that was a fundamental part to it. So it does address both additional learning needs and it addresses behavioural challenges as well. That's plenty from me, so I'll hand over to Sharon and then we'll kind of take your way through this as a team.
Thank you. The first job of the steering group was really to determine what we were thinking, what our aims were for the future. And as you can see, they've come up with a number of, there was a very long wish list to begin with, but our total aims came to very, very fundamental points, which really relate to all of our children in Monmouthshire. Whilst we might think that, ALN children and, children who have other sort of concerns in the inclusion area may well need to take our focus. In many ways, all of our children need that particular focus. And if we get it right for the children with additional learning needs, we get it right for absolutely everybody. So we've looked at, it's really important that there's equality of access to our education and that everyone is offering a high and very inclusive curriculum. We felt it was very important that children and young people remained within their community wherever possible, because we may be able to send them to school somewhere, but actually they have to live at home, and not just when they're a pupil and a young person, but for the rest of their life. So that was very, very important, and it was something that Eston, as Will alluded to, did identify when they visited us in 2012. The learner doesn't exist in in isolation. They have their families as well. And often, for us to be able to support an individual, we need to look to their families to support them collectively and holistically. And then early identification and early intervention is vitally important for all of our children. So as schools, we felt that we needed to think about how we were going to identify a need as soon as it arose, whether it's when a child starts school or something that's happened later on that's caused them some crisis that we need to pick up and be able to identify and address. And then we knew that we had the new ALN bill coming in, and we needed to ensure that whatever we were doing would be flexible enough to accommodate the needs of that and the changing needs within the authority. Over the last 10 to 15 years, priorities have changed. That's our needs assessment shows that. So whatever we were doing, we needed to make sure that it was future-proof. Okay. Right. Just some sort of facts and figures, really. Monmouthshire has got the second lowest proportion of pupils across Wales with additional learning needs, so 17.4%. We'd be expecting around about 20%. But compared with other authorities, more of our pupils had statements of special educational needs. And again, this is something that was identified by Estin when they visited us in 2012. And one of the things that we've done to try and address that is to look at providing resource assist money earlier so that children can have the support they need without going through a formal process. We've reduced the process time from 26 weeks down to, it's around about 12 weeks if all goes well, and we can get that help and support to the school as soon as we possibly can. There's still work to do on that because, obviously we have the new bill coming and we need to look at our provision to support that process. But there has been a reduction over the past 3 years, but nevertheless we are still above the Wales average. So in order for us to move forward, as a steering group, we looked at our sort of needs analysis and we looked at the data over the last academic year. And we found that there were some particular pinch points for us. Speech, language and communication was one of the highest needs in the county, and that links very much with the information that we get from our Flying Start colleagues and health colleagues who are identifying that in the communities where children are coming into school not being able to talk and communicate in the way that they used to previously. It's not a unique concern in Monmouthshire. That's, across the region and really across Wales. So, we're following that trend, but nevertheless, we know that it's a high need here. This is followed then by behaviour, emotional and social difficulties and autistic spectrum disorder. We're seeing an increase in those areas within the authority, and again, that will reflect increases in other authorities as well. And we've also got a relatively high number of young people identified with moderate learning difficulties. We spoke about them a moment ago. In some cases, that can vary from being, a very mild moderate, and some pupils may not need any additional support. But in our schools, we do have pupils in mainstream settings with differing levels and degrees of support to enable them to access the curriculum and experiences in the school appropriately in mainstream within their local community and with their peers as much as they possibly can. And that's just really a summary of the data that we've collected and collated based on what we know. And that's for the whole of Monmouthshire this year. Okay. Within Monmouthshire, we have obviously looked at the range of provision that we have. And we have our 3 SNRBs, and we have, Overmono, Pembroke. We have and had a place at Derry View. We've got our pupil referral service. We have the 2 new SNRBs, one already up and running in Caldecott and one in Monmouth, which is secondary provision. And we have our special school, which is for SEBD at Mountain House. And that's for 11 to 16 boys only school. In addition to the provision that we have within our schools, within our SNRBs and in our special school, we have pupils who attend out-of-county provisions, and that will be in placements that may well be other local authorities. So, for example, it may well be to a school that has particular expertise in an area of behaviour or in autistic spectrum disorder, and our children will move to that placement, or speech and language. And then we also access provision which is very specialist and independent provision. So that could be, for example, for somebody who's got visual impairment, who is, you know, who needs support from a very specialist provider, where maybe that provision is only available in a couple of places throughout the country, and those pupils will access that support there. So currently our provision for pupils is quite wide. I think there is the potential, with the change in provision that we hope to see, to ensure that more of these young people who currently are receiving provision outside of Monmouthshire, where appropriate, can actually access that within their local communities and within the county. So that's what we were trying to do. So I think I need to hand over now to Alison, really.
That's all right. So in terms of, Sharon talked about the aims of the review at the outset. And I think it's really important that we think about what drove us to our kind of design principles, I guess, were the fact that we had to meet the key principles of the Future Generations Act. That's really important in terms of how we designed it, in terms of how we thought about early intervention, prevention, working in an integrated way across services and so on, collaborating and involving people. So those 5 principles of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act are fundamental to it. There are that we meet the needs and the aspirations of the new Additional Learning Needs Bill, which is working its way through the Welsh Government at the moment, or through the Senedd at the moment, I should say. And finally, that, you know, there is sometimes a bit of a tension between the last 2 points on this slide, between how we meet the rights of the child and how that's represented in law and so on. But one of the things which I've been talking to head teachers about, and colleagues within the Directorate, is about how we really embed the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child, the 42 rights of the child that have been identified by the United Nations in a really meaningful way in terms of our ongoing work. So those were the 3 kind of legislative drivers in terms of how we got to the proposed new model. So I think now I'm going to pass over.
So, thank you very much. I've been in post since September on a secondment basis for just 2 days a week. So the first thing I did, and I hope Will doesn't mind, is I did challenge what was already on the table. I was part of the ALN review that took place earlier this year, and I'm very pleased to be coming to try and implement what was considered at that time and what was put on the table. So I started with one model. There have been many iterations already of my model. I'm on to what I now call 5A, and it is still a work in progress. I do make adjustments after meeting various people, and so I'm going to go through what is currently the model we are working on, and as I say, it is still a working document. So if I just go through that with you now, I've got 3 parts to this. Firstly, it's considering a central outreach provision with principles, overall principles, and these overall principles would be in all schools, particularly in primary school for early identification if you're talking at the younger age, but obviously as you go up the school, if a child comes into some sort of crisis, we need to notice that as soon as we possibly can to be able to give them the appropriate intervention and assessment and anything else required. As part of this, I would advocate a central team who could provide advice, outreach and support and assessment. And with it, once again, within all schools, a nurture and wellbeing principle. So we've got lots of staff in schools being trained as ELSAs. I personally have a fantastic ELSA in my school. She is working wonders with some children who may otherwise be disengaged. It's an amazing process. So it's CPD.
Do you just want to explain what ELSA is?
Yes, sorry. ELSA is an emotional literacy support assistant. So many schools are having a member of staff, a teaching assistant, or in my case, a higher level teaching assistant trained in the ELSA principles, and they work with children who perhaps have well-being issues, who are not accessing the curriculum to their full potential because they've got emotional problems from home or as they've been brought up. So we would be advocating that sort of approach in all our schools as an overarching principle. So, and obviously with that comes CPD. So we need to train our staff in schools to provide this sort of and then my central team, that I'm advocating a central team which would have our current educational psychologists, an advisory assessment teacher, access to speech and language therapy, CAMS worker, social worker, and a nurse. These would be a central overarching team that would work. Then within my model, I'm advocating. Oh, sorry, gone wrong, and I've gone wrong because I put mine up here to. I put them as provision. So I'm advocating a ALN satellite provision, which would encompass current units and some new units. So within this, and I've put them in inverted commas because we wouldn't necessarily know what designation they would have, but in principle you would have a head teacher overseeing this on a satellite basis with a deputy of a primary and a deputy secondary to support an administrator and access to music therapy. Assessment for this provision would be done within primary schools from the central team, so that once a child has been identified in their mainstream school, there is a team that can support and look at this child to see whether mainstream remains their provision or whether they need something more specialist. I've done a north and south model. And so if you cut it down the middle, you have a south and then you have a north. If there are units named, they are existing units or they are units that have just been put in place or due to be put in place. Where there is no unit identified, I've just said south or north, and we need to look at perhaps that provision if we go forward with this model. So on the left-hand side, as I look at it, so yeah, left-hand side, we have the south model. So Pembroke Primary SNRB at present currently has 20 places. I would be perhaps advocating if we could go to 24 places, if at all possible. They would be the children with the more complex needs, the PMLD children, the children who are currently in those provisions would be the type of children we'd be advocating with some ASD as well. But alongside that, I would say we need, because of the high numbers of pupils with ASD and SLCD that were identified in the earlier slides, opening new units, north and south, to cater for those children in two classes. One for the autistic spectrum disorder children, one for those children with speech, language and communication disorders, the children who have extreme anxiety, who struggle in larger placements there. Then secondary provision would move on from there. So you'd have your, that's why they're colour-coded. Pembroke Primary would move to, traditionally to Caldecott. You may have some children from mainstream who have managed in primary but may need to go into a more specialist provision at secondary. We would have clear entry and exit criteria for all of these children. And then at secondary as well, we would look at a class for the ASD, SLCD children. And it was interesting you mentioned some of the children who might be in that buffer class would be in that class, that sort of provision, if you see what I mean. And it's not, we haven't decided where that would be, hence south. Yeah, so it might hit some of those children that with those needs there. So that might address some of that. So I've got that mirrored in north and south. We would try to cater for as many children as we possibly could within our local communities. As Sharon quite rightly said, they need to be there, but there will still be one or two children where the specialism is just too much for a small authority. We are very small. For instance, I was given an example of children with visual impairments who are blind, and with only having, say, 2 in the authority, you couldn't very well have a school for just 2 children. They would want to go to a school where they can meet and play with children of the same. It's, you know, more specialist placement. And hopefully under this model, we will reduce the number of out-of-county placements to just those real specialisms. So hence bringing the money back into investing in our provision for our children to be within county. That is the ALN. And then I'm also advocating a second type of provision, because the other area where we have high numbers of children are the children with SEBD or BSD. It's the same, just swap the reiterations around. Once again, a satellite provision with a head teacher and a deputy head teacher for short-term placements, this time instead of primary and secondary, short-term placements, and one for long-term placements. Right, within this then, on the pink side of the model, we would have a primary PRU, and rather than be in a service where children are supported in schools, which could still be a service that's offered, we would actually have a short stay provision for some children to actually go out of their school for a short period of time for intervention and then go back to the school on a phase programme, their original school, once they've received that intervention. If that hasn't worked, then we may look at them moving on to a longer term provision, which is provided within this model on the red side. Also then, for secondary, 4 hubs for children within the Abergavenny area, Monmouth area, Caldicot and Chepstow area. Although those areas are so close together, I've put them in case they could become one larger one because of the geography of Monmouthshire. Then on the red side would be long-term SEBD provision. We have a number of primary children at present who go out of county. Because we don't have provision for those, the idea would be to have a primary and secondary long-term provision for both boys and girls that would go right up to the age of 18 or 19, so extend the provision that is currently offered. And then for those children that at Key Stage 3 and 4, there is also the satellite provision, which is college courses, for those children who need something a little bit different again, or for the likes of the odd child, as Richard mentioned, with perhaps a lack child who needs some alternative provision, provided it would be within that area. I still have out of county on there, but the idea on this one would be an absolute minimal, and hopefully would actually disappear in this model totally as time goes on. So that's where we stand at present. Thank you. Well, yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Sorry.
Excellent. Thank you, Alison. And just from me as well, just thank you for your time and your work with us as well on this. In terms of the next steps, and what Alison's just described is the kind of the point we've reached. And I know that we've been, I've referred to the ALN review many times in this committee, and we felt it was important that it came back, or it came to you rather than back to you. It came to you for you to be able to see the work that's ongoing, to see the evidence that we've been drawing on, and where our thinking is in terms of how we take it forward in the future. But there is still a considerable distance to go, and I think it would be important to remind everybody of that. Clearly, we do need to look at the costings of the models. Councillor Watkins' question earlier today does kind of highlight there will always be challenges around the way in which we provide services for children with additional learning needs, and for actually, in its broader sense, our vulnerable children in terms of those who require additional support, like the behaviour resources that Alison's just described. So there are costs that we need to consider. We are working through that and making sure that anything that we do propose is fully costed, fully rounded, and is able to go to you as a select committee, and then after that to the executive and so on, for a proper decision that's robust and fully informed, rather than this being something, a step that is potentially not sustainable in the medium to longer term. There is in that statement a commitment to keep coming back to this committee if the committee wishes, to see how it develops, how the model actually formalises, and to look at the costs associated with that. I think we are getting to a point, and I know that there is probably a requirement for, I think what we will loosely refer, there's professional dialogue internally to take place around some of the aspects of the model to make sure that we're all kind of square and we kind of really understand all of the nuances in it. But we then do need to consult and engage very widely around our proposals. That obviously will include members, it will include stakeholder groups. Critically, it will include parents, children themselves, the schools who might be affected by some of the changes which we're discussing, the governors of those schools, management boards of the PRU and so on, as well as the partners we work with very closely in this area. So our health colleagues and the advocacy groups that we work with the families as well will all have to be kind of brought into this. So I guess I'm trying to say that we've brought this to you as a work in progress. So it's not a final model, but hopefully it will give you a degree of reassurance in terms of the breadth of analysis we've done to begin to think about what we need in the future, for you to understand what we have in county currently, and for you to have a sense about what we're thinking about in the future. I don't think there's anything else I need to say at the moment, but we'll be happy between us to take any questions.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Councillor Watkins.
Thank you. First of all, I'm generally delighted to see the plans. It looks like it's really exciting, and I'm really positive and love to work with you to move this forwards. With the idea of the extra, I'll call them units for want of a better word, for the ASD and the other additional needs and the emotional and social behavioural issues, would you be planning on placing those within existing schools? So would you add on a bit to an existing primary school, or would you build a complete different building?
I'll answer that one if that's okay. At the moment, we're looking at where we can find provision that might suit that. I think at the moment, it is genuinely too early to say. I think the discussions we've just gone through in terms of new build, I would probably discount that as an option at the moment. However, there are always opportunities, and I think we have to look widely at our estate within education and our estate more broadly in terms of the council as well, and look to make sure that we maximise that for value.
Okay, Councillor Powell, and then Mr. Fowler.
It all looks very, good going forward. Would you have this specialised team? If obviously, I'm thinking more of the girls. No, because the boys do have Mountain House for real big problems. But if you have you don't have actually a special unit anywhere, these children will be within a mainstream school going for education, I assume. Will your team travel round to those different schools in order to accommodate?
Oh, the central team?
Yes, central team.
The central team are the current, the central team are the current educational psychologists, so they offer a service now, so that would be similar. And the advisory teacher, assessment teacher, would be someone who could go in and assess the children at an early age and offer advice. With regard to the speech and language therapist, CAMS worker, social worker, nurse, yes, they would go and support the units as required. So it would be down to the two head teachers to call on that central team, and that when they required those, when they needed them. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, just for clarity around that, the central team is a resource that would be able to be deployed, much as they are now in terms of EP's role, and so to go out and work with children in the very first instance and assess them. The models would be staffed as well, so they wouldn't be providing the ongoing teaching resource to those children. that would be factored in, you know, so if we take, for instance, Pembroke, in terms of primary, they have a full complement of staff there to support the children who are there. So that's how that would work.
Hi, two questions, kind of one for Alison first, and it's more of a curiosity really. On your ALN satellite provision diagram, you've got a box with the kind of heavy hitters of head teachers and deputy head teachers and administrators and music therapist. I was just curious over the high profileness of a music therapist.
It's more, rather than put a separate music therapist in each provision, by putting the music therapist in overarching that music therapist, it's more a service rather than a therapist. We would buy into, say, Gwent Music, some music therapy, and because they're not in one provision the whole time, they might spend, you know, a day a week in Pembroke, a day a week in Overmono. That's why I put them at the top rather than them having that sort of high power.
It was just a curiosity because they seem to have a heavy weighting.
No, I put them there because they overarch all of the provision. They can provide for all of them.
Okay. So then the second...
Sorry, I was just going to say it'd be access to for all pupils within that model. So you know, a post that was designed to service the needs of all vulnerable children within the local authority.
Secondly, and thank you for that. Secondly, it looks a great kind of provision, and it looks like extensive provision and well thought out. My only then concern comes to funding for this and cost. It looks kind of very expensive. And I just kind of hope that there's a reassurance that schools are not going to have money taken out of their budgets to pay extra into this and lose the ability to provide the provision that schools currently do.
No, absolutely. And I think it would be fair to say I don't think the executive member would have allowed us kind of a blank cheque to go and develop the perfect provision. Although I think that actually what this is designed to do is to provide within county the provision that we know the children who are within our schools, and because of the great relationships we have in our early year settings and so on, which are improving all the time, you know, we have knowledge of what is coming through. There will always be some instances where children arrive in county or whereby specific traumas happen to children, so needs accelerate very quickly, and we'll always have to take account of that. But in as far as we can, in understanding what is in our schools currently, what the pressures are and so on, this is a model that will hopefully begin to mitigate the very, very high cost placements that exist out of county. So enabling us to keep our children in county, we should be saving from those out of county placements. So one of the things which I think Sharon's been very clear about when she's been discussing this with the teams and so on, is that if you do have, for instance, on the SEBD provision, we will have to have for the short-term placements exceptionally tight entry and exit criteria, because this wouldn't be a model whereby, you know, schools are able to kind of move children away from their mainstream. This would be very clearly identified, you know, children presenting a specific set of risks. They would go and access an alternative provision. They would come back after that provision had been provided, and that would be very much the model that we look to put in place. So absolutely commitment around us managing this within, certainly within our existing cost envelope. And, you know, we are hopeful that we will do that, absolutely. And we're working closely right across the CYP Directorate to maximise that. And as I say, you know, in answer to Councillor Watkins' question about maximising the value of assets that we hold currently and making sure that we do that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Sharon?
Just to add, really, that the model of having, you know, short-term placements, there will be an expectation for schools to be able to send another member of staff with the pupil over the period of time in order for us to build capacity within schools as well, because, you know, we have to be able to build that capacity in schools in the longer term to be able to meet that wider range of need in school. So this model will enable us to do that very effectively.
Yeah. A further advantage of this model is that it might not benefit CYP directly, but it will benefit the wider council's finances, is that we spend a lot of money on travel. and that doesn't impact upon the outcomes for a young person. It's not a direct impact. So hopefully with more localised provision, there will be less resources spent on travel. Obviously, get my green credentials in here, carbon footprint is reduced as well. Okay, so that will have a wider impact on the local authority.
Mr. Fowler.
Can I just ask one final question? I was just wondering what the time frame is for this, because it all kind of sounds wonderful and it'd be great for our kids to be getting the benefit of it. I was just wondering how long, because the ALNB review has been going on a while, and I was just wondering when the outcome will finally come to fruition.
We'll be looking to move to a position, I think, once we've had some internal conversations to make sure we've got a finalised model that we're content with across the different parts of the CYP Directorate to actually begin that formal consultation process. There are some aspects that will require potentially statutory consultation and dialogue. That does take time. So we're beginning to work those up now into a sense. So some aspects of it in terms of the first page of the 3 pages of the model, in terms of how we think about early identification, nurture and well-being. You know, we've been thinking around things like the ELSA interventions. There's another intervention called Thrive, which is really positive in terms of attachment disorder and so on. So we'd be thinking about how we roll those out much earlier. As I say, I think that's a really important challenge. And if we come back again to discuss it, then it's one of the things which certainly I would expect us to be able to provide to CYP a very clear timeline for the implementation of the review.
Councillor Watkins.
Sorry, I'm going to sound stuck record. Looking at some of the provision in terms of the central team, there's references to services that I know come under health, so CAMS and speech and language therapy. Are you planning on getting some of that service to be held within the authority, or is it just building up links with Health Board in order to provide it?
Certainly, when the new model is implemented, we are duty-bound to work across multi-agencies, and that will involve the wider range of professionals. The new model is set up to look at identifying need collectively, to all work together in the best interests of the child, and therefore whether they work within Monmouthshire team, as in employed by the local authority, we will be working very closely in partnership.
I wonder, I'll go to the back in a moment, but I wonder if I could just get a bit of greater clarity there. Working closely isn't the same as employing. I know that from a parent point of view, that barely a week seems to go by without there being a news item about parents being extremely frustrated about trying to get officialdom to meet the needs of their child and so on. And I know that personally in a previous existence, very often issuing a statement of special educational needs within the legal time scale was often thwarted by the inability to liaise in time with other agencies, and this being a cause of great frustration. It's okay to say, yes, we will liaise with the child and adolescent mental health service, but when that service is also under incredible pressure, can you move to a position where you'll be able to say, hand on heart, we will issue every statement within the allotted timescale? And could you also tell me, at the present time, how many statements are issued within the allocated timescale, and how many parents have complained to Monmouthshire about that?
Thank you for your question. Certainly, regarding the new model, as Will has said, it at the moment is still under consultation. There are 100 amendments that have been made to this particular document. Some of that does actually recognise the contribution of health. How strongly and whether that goes through is a question that we all need to have answered, really. Because you're quite right, where we do have statements that are delayed, it is due to the information that we require from health. We are pretty good at getting our statements out on time. However, the decision was taken a long time ago to make sure that we issued a statement that was appropriate so that we had all the information, even if it meant waiting a little longer, because actually at the centre of this is the child and meeting their needs. I will get you those statistics because they change a little bit, as you can imagine. Obviously, we have a few parents who are concerned if things don't go to time, and I fully accept that, but we do work closely with them so that they understand where the reasons lie. At the moment, it's 26 weeks for us to issue a statement. Under the new model, we'll be looking at individual development plans, and the turnaround time for that is 10 weeks. So, there is a real urgency to ensure that we have robust arrangements in place to be able to do this well and effectively. We'll need to work very closely with our schools, who will be big partners in this, but also with all of those multi-agency teams. And over the past sort of 2 years, we've been beginning to work much more closely with Children's Services. We can regularly call meetings with a very, very fast response now. However, the volume of work, the volume of requests, we have to kind of wait and see until we've got the final documentation. And also the code of practice will reflect that. But in Wales, once it's implemented, it will become statutory and not guidance. So we will have no alternative but to work with it.
Can I add some supplementary information as well, Chair? Welsh Government have given the Consortium and Innovation Grant, which is £250,000 for last year and for this year. One of the strands we've been looking at is how we develop the practice amongst our ALNCOs within the local authority, not just within the local authority, but across the South East Wales Consortia. Very pleased to say that one of our Monmouthshire ALNCOs, Hayley Page from Monmouthshire, has the job of lead ALNCO across the region. So we're in a tremendous opportunity to look at all the best practices in place, not just in Monmouthshire schools, but in schools from across the region, so that we can use that to improve our practice and improve our universal curriculum offer, because we need to be ensuring that colleagues within schools provide the best learning opportunities and provision for the young people. And if that is enhanced, then that quality of paperwork and provision will be there, which will assist us with the reduction from 26 weeks to 10. And then picking up on the health element, there is a working party which will be looking at developing terms of reference for continuing care with health, which looks at our most high tariff young people, and I suspect officers that will be attending that will be having challenging times and challenging conversations with health, saying, come on, you've got a significant part to play in there. And my chief officer's handed me that baton to attend that meeting, so looking forward to sparring with colleagues in health. Okay.
Okay, thanks for that. Sorry, I cut you off. You wanted to ask a question, Councillor Woodhouse.
Well, not so much a question, more a thank you, because as it said at the beginning, progress to date, this review, is a lot of hard work gone into it, and it's good to feel that you communicated this to us at this stage, so we know where you're at. As you said, Plan 5A. There's obviously things happening all the time, so I just like to say thank you for bringing it to us at this stage.
Thank you for that. Any further comments or questions before we move on? In which case, if I could thank you all for that presentation and wish you well in its completion, and thanks for coming and giving us the situation as to where we are now. If we can go back to the agenda then, I was right in saying that was agenda item 7, so let's move on to agenda item 8, which is looking at the action list, which is on page 67, and then the CYP work programme. Miss Eilert.
Thanks, Chair. You've got the action list in front of you. We usually just take that as accepted, if you're happy with that. The actions have been put into place, and that ties in neatly with the work programme. Your work programme has slightly altered since the agenda was dispatched, but not in the immediate future. I've just received some items that would be possible for scrutiny in the new year, particularly your February meeting, we've had a request to bring leisure services for young people to this meeting, and that was following a very successful event held here last week with primary schools, and they would like to showcase some of the work that they've done around physical literacy, leadership and ambassador schemes. So if you'd be willing to agree to add that to the work programme, we could take that for February. In the immediate term, we've got a meeting on the 13th of November, which is a special meeting requested by Social Services to deliver excellence in children's services. So it's the Children's Services Improvement Programme, and I believe you've all been notified of the date of that meeting. The 7th of December meeting is budget scrutiny, which I'm sure you will relish as your first opportunity. It's a favoured item for many members, and that will take up quite a bulk of the meeting. But we've also got a short performance report from Richard Jones. In the future, the performance reporting will be a little bit more meaty, but given that this is the first of a new style of reports, it will be a sort of lighter touch. But we would like to invite, I think, Cabinet members along for a discussion with you on performance at that meeting, and I'll be in touch with them in due course. We've also got a short report from Nikki Wellington on schools funding formula. Just to update you on a position with a previous matter that we've discussed in relation to Engage to Change, which is the Youth Council. We had discussed the possibility of them coming to one of your meetings to present their forthcoming priorities. And we've had some difficulties really in terms of dates, because they cannot get the time out of their school day to be able to come to one of your meetings. So what we've toyed with is the idea of you going to one of their meetings, which is much more scary prospect, and it is held at a sort of a later time, but it's a time that they could do. So I'm not expecting that all members would be able to come, but certainly myself and the chair, and I'll probably be asking the Cabinet member also if he would be able to attend, and will, because they would like to present to us their forthcoming priorities. And one of those, I think their foremost priority, is about delivering them a sort of education programme that meets their needs in the future. That ties in very well with a workshop that we held with Economy Select last week, where we actually discussed how we upskill our young people for the jobs that we don't yet know about, future prospects. So we will send the invite to all of you, but Engage to Change meet at 5 o'clock here. So we'll see how that works out for you. So I think the prospect of that is December, early December. So I'll send the invite to you today. Only other thing for you to be aware of, we've got a Local Democracy Day, which will be taking place later in November, and we've invited the Engage to Change to that meeting, and they will be wanting to ask some members some questions, and it should be quite an informative day, but we're hoping to build a stronger dialogue with the Youth Council. I think that's all there is to say at the moment, Chair.
Mr McLean.
Sorry, Hazel. It would be good if we could bring Key Stage 4 back at some stage. Just so members are aware, we have a kind of a series of iterations of our Key Stage 4 outcomes. We have the on-the-day results, which are what children receive on that day in August. At the end of October, we have what's called SSP1, which are the next cuts, the next kind of level of granularity. The final version are normally ready kind of towards the end of November, but it would be good to have them back to you probably before the date, I think, which is indicated for the Chief Officer's report, which would be, I think, a February one. I think that seems like a long time from the actual results and examination.
Chair, you could agree to add it to the 7th of December meeting, but you will have quite a lengthy meeting there. That's always the conundrum for members as to whether to hold additional meetings, special meetings, or whether to add it to an existing meeting. So I'll take your thoughts on that, please.
Clearly, Key Stage 4 outcomes is a vital thing for us to be able to have a look at and have our say. What's the feeling of committee? Would you like to add it to what could then become quite a lengthy meeting? And I'll do my best as chair to move things along. There's people are nodding, so generally, yes, if we could add that to December then. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for that, Mr. McLean. Moving on then, the next agenda item, is it really for us to note, or is there any comment, Cabinet and Council Forward Planner?
That is your opportunity as a committee to consider the forthcoming decisions of Cabinet and Council and make a decision as to whether you would like to refer any of those to yourselves for consideration. We're trying to populate it as far as we can in advance, but this is the published version of the work programme for Cabinet and Council. So it's for noting, but should you wish to ask that any item be brought forward, or if you'd just like to have a look at the report, we can ask for report authors to email those to you. But this is the opportunity to use the planner to build things into your work programme.
Okay, thank you very much. The final agenda item then, item 10, is just to note that we do have an additional meeting, as the scrutiny manager just told us. It's on the 13th of November at 10 o'clock. And then our next scheduled meeting is on the 7th of December at 10 o'clock. Could I thank you all for your attendance, and a special thanks to our visitors and guests for their contribution this morning, to our Cabinet member, and thank you all for your contributions. Thank you. Bye.